Oh, well, I'm glad to see there's still as many people here as I started. Right then, so part 2. The kings are dead, so what now? Now, what are the two kingdoms going to do? Now, you might want to bear in mind as well that both Jezebel in the north and Athaliah in the south are still alive. Those wicked women, it's not really a name you'd give your kids these days. So, I was going to tell you about Jehu because he did a lot of dispatching in the last episode. So, he was anointed king by Elijah. After Elijah had gone off to the caves and was feeling a bit sorry for himself after having destroyed all the prophets of Baal, God said, go to the north, anoint King Jehu king over Israel. And so he went off and did so. So there was a popular revolt in the northern kingdom. People were just about sick and tired with having the Omrides in the north and their foreign influences that were coming in. It was time for a change. It was time to vote Labour. And so anyway, there's a popular revolt. Well, and he purged Israel of all its trappings and all the bad stuff, all the Asherahs and things like that. Now, it's interesting when we think about what is going on and why there is a popular revolt and why people are suddenly discovering Yahweh again and starting to turn up at church. Is it because they genuinely have had a revelation of the Lord, or is it because they're equating Yahwism with nationalism? And, sometimes you can see that with people like, say, even UKIP. David Cameron just the other day was talking about sort of, Britain is a Christian country and things like that. It kind of gets the voters in, sort of like equating nationalism with religion. And this is probably one of those things that is going on with Jehu. Anyway, as I said, he killed Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah up in Jezreel. He also killed Jezebel. And basically, he turned up and she was going, what's all the commotion? His guards and him, they all pile into the palace, push her out of a second-story window where she disappears out onto the patio, and they sit down to have something to eat. When they come down, they find the dogs have eaten her and left only her feet and her hands and her skull. Nice story, but it was prophesied that she would end somehow like that. So, bad people die bad ways. And he was renowned for driving like a nutcase on his chariot. So everybody knew Jehu was coming down the road with the way he drove. To drive like Jehu, they said. So Jezebel has been dispatched. Jehu is king in the north. Well, what are we going to do about Athaliah in the south? Well, she was Ahaziah's mum, who, as we read, is dead. And she is also Ahab's daughter, so she does not have a good pedigree. She was a committed Baal worshipper. And she murdered all her grandchildren and seized power. So Ahaziah is dead, and she then goes and kills all of his kids and seizes the throne for herself. But this is not going to last very long. She is not a Judahite. She's from the northern kingdom, and there's that nationalism welling up in the south. And so therefore they're also then co-opting Yahwism, to sort of like push forward and get rid of this woman. So basically, she is killed in a popular revolt. Everybody sort of like breaks out and kills her, and you can read about that. It's quite an exciting story. So what's going to happen if all the kids are dead and Athaliah is dead? Well, let's stop for a minute. Okay, now, we saw that the Assyrians had got a bloody nose at Kakar and had gone running back. Well, they're coming back with vengeance. So Shalmaneser III wants his pound of flesh after that. And so in 841, he comes back and defeats the Aramean army in Syria. Then he lays siege to Damascus. The only problem is Damascus isn't going to roll over for him, and it holds out. So he gets a bit fed up and thinks, well, I'll tell you what, why don't I just go further south and see if I can make some money going round and exacting tribute from any poor peasant that I happen to come across. So he visits Tyre and Sidon, and then he goes and sees Jehu of Israel and wants some money from him. And there is this, it's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. You can see it in the British Museum. And there you can see Jehu on his knees kissing Assyrian feet and paying his tribute. And this is recorded on this obelisk. So obviously Jehu paid up, otherwise the picture would have been carved quite differently. Anyway, so Shalmaneser III, annoyed that he hasn't taken Damascus, returns home to deal with his own domestic problems. You will find that the Assyrians have a lot of domestic problems and they're always having to go home and sort them out. A bit like me. So we've got Hazael. Okay, Hazael, he's a Syrian, not Assyrian, he's a Syrian. And we saw that he fended off the Assyrians. Okay, assassinated Hadadezer and becomes king himself. And he fends off the Assyrians. The Assyrians are gone. Syria is now the dominant power in the region. These are the big boys. They've got the big guns. So he takes the Transjordanian holdings from Jehu. So all the northern areas that Jehu once had, Hazael goes, I think I'll have them for myself. And interestingly, this guy is also anointed by Elijah to be king over Damascus. And interestingly, when you read the story, Elisha is none too happy about having to anoint this guy. And he actually says he's crying. And Hazael says, why are you crying? And he says, because I know one day you are going to be the king, that he's going to rip open pregnant women, he's going to burn down towns and destroy things. So, it's interesting the way God uses these different nations to work out his purposes and plans. So, then you've got Jehoahaz, who is king in the north. Now, here's Jehu's son. He happened to still be kicking around after Jehu died. Now, he is brought to his knees by Hazael as well. In the battle, basically, he is left, he's reduced to 10 chariots, 50 horsemen, and about 10,000 foot soldiers. He pretty much a police force is left to him. Now, 10 chariots, if you consider that at the Battle of Kakar, Ahab had 2,000 chariots, he hasn't got many left at all. 50 horsemen isn't going to go very far. This is looking like post-war Germany. There is going to be no chance that Israel's going to do anything to anybody anytime soon. Now, back down south. You remember Athaliah had died, and I said, who's going to take over? Well, praise the Lord, Jehoiada had been hidden away as a little baby by the high priest and his wife, who happened to be his aunt and uncle, and they hid him in the temple precincts. So when Athaliah is killed in this popular revolt, the high priest and the priests get into power, and then they start to put things in place. So things start to look good again. The temple is purified, all the abominations are taken out, and Yahwism takes off. However, Jehoiada grows up, and he's no longer that cute little kid doing as he's told by the high priest. And eventually, the high priest himself dies, and things begin to backslide. And he starts to sort of, bring in foreign gods, and things aren't looking good anymore. And so people start to point out his blind spots, as it were. And he doesn't like this, and so he goes and has them killed. So this is a man who is now out of control and is not being particularly godly about anything. I'm sure there's an analogy in there about listening to your God-appointed ministers or something like that. Anyway, meanwhile, back up north, you've got Hazael. Continues his tour of the Levant and going further south. Okay, so he besieged and took Gath, which is a Philistine town. And then he left Judah alone on receipt of a large tribute being paid. So you see the Syrians are cleaning up, they're taking the money, they're the power, that's who you pay your taxes to now. Anyway, people have just about had enough of Joash, and he gets himself assassinated. So, the 8th century, well, things can only get better, because they can't get much worse at the moment. So, you've got this other Assyrian, Adad-Ninari, comes on the scene. Now, he crushes Damascus in 802, And he lays Ben-Hadad II under a ruinous tribute, okay? The Assyrians are really trying to push into this area, and the Syrians are now having to pay big tribute. He took a token tribute from Israel and Tyre and Sidon and the other places. He had a little wander around, took a bit of tax, but not like he was taxing the Syrians. So, unfortunately, Assyria was unable to follow up on its successes, and probably the old domestic problems reared their ugly head again, and he had to go home. But the important thing to remember is it had broken Syrian power in the region. So although Judah and Israel weren't doing particularly well themselves, they weren't being threatened by Syria in the north anymore. So you then have Jehoash come to the throne. Now he was the grandson of Jehu, and he recovered the cities his father Jehoahaz had lost. You know, the hapless king brought to his knees. Well, there's no Syrians around to stop him, so they start to reassert their own power and authority and stretch out, and they move north. He was provoked into a war with Judah, and this was a war that Jehoash really didn't want. Let's see what happened. So, Amaziah, you can imagine what kind of character he is. Not the shiniest button in the box. Okay, now, he wished to exert his influence and authority over Edom. And he thought, that would be really great. I want Edom back. I want the copper mines down in the south. But Judah at this time did not have the great army it once had. So he co-opted a lot of Israelite mercenaries to help him retake Edom. He thought, these are hard-bitten warriors. They'll be some use to me. Only at the last minute, he thought, do you know what? I don't think I really need them. Now, the mercenaries were only going to get paid in the booty that they took from looting Edom. So they've been brought all the way down from Israel. They're sitting around in Judah waiting to go over the border, and now they actually aren't going to go looting. They're not happy. So they decide to make up the loss of earnings. They go and start ransacking around in Judah, collecting what they felt was owed to them. What do you do with a bunch of mercenaries with nowhere to go? Well, this really annoys Amaziah. And he basically, because they were Israelite mercenaries, he declares war on Israel, naturally enough. Now Joash points out that he doesn't think this is the best idea, given the fact that Jehoash has the big army, and Amaziah didn't have an army worth talking about because he needed Israelite mercenaries in the first place. But this man, doesn't take the adage, look before you leap. This man is a leaper, not a looker. So he basically goes north and doesn't get very far before north comes and meets him and gives him an absolute drubbing. So Jehoash reduced Judah to a position of helplessness. He captured Amaziah and stuck him back on his throne, making him pay a tribute, looted Jerusalem and retired with hostages. Not a good start for his career. So Judah was brought to their knees. Amaziah fled a plot. He got wind of the fact that people thought he was an idiot and they wanted him dead, so he ran. But they caught up with him and assassinated him at Lachish. So here we have Israel in the late to the middle of the 8th century, looking like it's getting quite powerful and quite big. So you've got Jehoash, and then you've got his son Jeroboam II. Now at the same time, you have these contemporary Assyrian rulers, Shalmaneser IV, Ashradan III, and Ashurnenari V. And these were all, hapless rulers. They had lots of trouble and domestic problems. They had people in the east attacking them in the north and the south. They had rebellions. They were no good at what they did. Here, Assyria is at its rock bottom. And it's also during one of these three kings' reigns that we read about the book of Jonah. And it's at this point when Jonah goes to Nineveh, when things look really bad and dire. It's during this period of history, because we know that Jonah was in the court of Jeroboam II, mentions that in 2 Kings. So this is the period at which we see Jonah going to Assyria. Anyway, Jeroboam II, he was a bad king. That's his symbol that he had. But he was a bad king and did bad in the eyes of Yahweh. He was an idolater, and he oppressed the poor. we see the prophets Amos and Hosea speaking out about the oppression of the land, of the people in Jeroboam's day and Jeroboam. So this is the context in which we read those two prophetic books as well. But there was peace and prosperity in northern Israel. Things had never been so good, depending on who you were. So Jeroboam restored the Solomonic northern borders. So this is what it looked like when Jeroboam took the throne, and that's what it looked like when he was on the throne and he retook all that area. So things looked like they were really good. They were going places, but that depended. If you were rich, you were going to get richer, but if you were poor, you were going to get poorer. The middling classes were doing all right. So there was this kind of prosperity. And it probably, did that owe something to the fact that we were into this idolatry and foreign gods and other things? We were getting into the modern ways of living up here in the north, and they were oppressing the poor. And, you don't have to read those two prophetic books before you soon realise they speak a lot about what goes on today with the way we oppress the poor and the way the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. So, way back down in the south, in Judah, you've got King Uzziah, also known as King Azariah. So, depending, where in the text you're looking, sometimes he's referred to as King Azariah. This guy was a good king. He walked in the ways of Yahweh. So he repaired the walls in Jerusalem, refitted and modernised the army. He introduced new and novel siege engines, retook Elat from Edom, securing the southern trade routes from Arabia and India, and took major strongholds from the Philistines. And he just was going places. And that was only matched by his pride. And he decided he was going to take a sacrifice into the temple and sacrifice it himself. And he was struck with leprosy and, couldn't appear in public as a leper. So at this point, his son Jotham has to become his co-regent, although Uzziah is probably the king behind the throne. So it seems a sad end to what seems to be a promising career. So anyway, you've got King Jotham, and he built up, he built one of the temple gates in Jerusalem, and he built a number of cities in the borderlands, and he also subdued the Ammonites. So things were looking good. So on the surface, things, had began to look good. They hadn't been this good since the two kingdoms, since the days of Solomon. So the big building projects going on. The north was secure. It was going it was going further north, taking all those lands. Prosperity and wealth were coming into both the north and the southern kingdoms. Not since the days of Solomon had they seen money and prosperity like this. But was everything okay? Was it all right by just looking at how prosperous people's lives were, how well they were living, how comfortable their living was? Was this a sign that they were being blessed? Or was it a sign of something else? And was there something else wrong here, that they'd moved away from Yahweh and worship? So they still followed their corrupt practices. And this was a particular problem in the northern kingdom. So Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrian power, returns again to the area. And basically, he goes in and he wants people to bow to him because he is the power to be paid. So we've got this sudden run of Israelite kings that all seem to just want to kill each other and put themselves in power. It's like the general election gone mad. So you've got Zechariah, who is Jeroboam's son. He reigns 6 months until he's murdered by Shallum ben Jabesh, who was terminated after only 1 month by Menahem. Okay then. In 738 BC, the Assyrians arrived in the west and demanded a heavy tribute from northern Israel. Now, Menahem perhaps gives in a little too easily to the Assyrians, probably because he's got a bit of a shaky position himself in actually being on the throne. He's just assassinated something. But there's a bit of a popular revolt, and he's soon removed from power by Pekahiah. So Pekahiah is on the throne, but he's removed by Pekah, who assassinates him. And this was probably at the Syrian instigation. Okay, so the Syrians were thinking, we're fed up of paying tribute to the Assyrians. We need some allies. This guy Pekah probably looks like the guy to be in charge of Israel and help us go and sort them out. So slowly there is this fermenting resentment of Assyrian rule in the area. So down south, you've got Ahaz. Now Ahaz is the king of Judah, and things have been going okay. But he notices everybody else, is going anti-Assyrian, and he seems to fly against the flow and thinks that Assyria's great, and he loves all things Assyrian. He likes wearing their clothes, he likes worshipping their gods, and thinks it's all very great. Now, this annoys his neighbours who are thinking about sort of throwing off the Assyrian yoke. So they decide they don't want Judah in their rear while they're going off to fight Assyria. So they have what they call the Syro-Ephraimite War. Ephraim is a northern tribe of Israel, so it would be the Syro-Israelite War, but Syro-Ephraimite War, it's the same area. So they declare war on King Ahaz and go and sort him out before then turning to the north and going to sort out the Assyrians. You should never fight a war on two fronts. Okay, so what happens? You've got Damascus or Syria and northern Israel attacking Judah. You've then got the Philistines moving in and the Edomites moving in. Judah is surrounded and looks like it's just going to be squeezed and snuffed out. So Ahaz turns to Tiglath-Pileser and asks for help. Now, he is told by Isaiah that is really not a good idea. Don't ask the Assyrians for help. The Lord will help. Basically Ahaz doesn't listen to Isaiah, and you can read all about that in Isaiah chapter 7 and chapter 8. So basically, Tiglath-Pileser turns up on the scene to sort all the quarrelling out and help his mate Ahaz out. So he goes south down the south coastal roads. He takes out the Philistines, blocks any possible intervention from the Egyptians coming up the road. Then he moves back through Israel and through Syria, trouncing the place and turning it upside down. At which point, Pekah is assassinated by Hoshea. Hoshea turns up on the scene, assassinates him in the vain attempt to try and hold back the vengeance of the Assyrians, which just about does, and Hoshea gets put on the throne, paying a massive tribute. But it would appear that Israel is on a road to destruction. It is just out of control and it just can't help itself. The writing is on the wall, to use another biblical story. So anyway, Tiglath-Pileser III, in these days, this is the time when Hezekiah comes on the throne down in the south. Anyway, Tiglath-Pileser III dies, and you can read about that in Isaiah 14. Now usually when one of the emperors, one of the rulers of the empires dies, that's the time when everybody just kicks off and tries to rebel. So when anybody dies, they have to sort of the next in line has to go around trying to stamp his approval on everything. So Shalmaneser V now comes on the throne. So Israel takes that as its cue to start rebelling. So in 724, Israel rebels. Shalmaneser V is none too pleased about this and lays siege to Samaria. At this point, the king is taken into captivity, but Samaria holds out for 2 years under siege. And so, in fact, Shalmaneser dies during the siege, and Sargon II, his successor, has to come and take over the siege. Eventually, Samaria falls in 722 BC, which is an important date to put in your Bible, because that's when the northern kingdom of Israel ceases to exist. That the northern tribes are just taken into exile and they never return. They're lost for eternity. Unless you believe what the Mormons say, and then they got into cowhide boats and sailed to America. I think I prefer the fact that they just disappeared in the exile to Assyria. So, as I said, Hoshea gets taken by Shalmaneser, who then died during the siege, and then Sargon II has to take over, and we see the end of Israel, the northern kingdom. So, Unfortunately, whilst down there, Sargon discovers that there's a rebellion breaking out back in Babylon. It's the old domestic problems always surfacing, so he has to run back and go and deal with those. At the same time, you get a resurgent Egypt. So you get the 25th dynasty come about. And this is an Ethiopian king called Pianki. Okay, he's from Ethiopia. And they start to have this resurgent power where they're going to start, reasserting themselves. And everybody thinks, whoa, we might get behind the Egyptians now. So Hezekiah thinks, because everybody else is doing it, he thinks, I'm going to revolt as well. That'll be good. Let's throw off the Assyrian yoke. Fortunately, the wise counsel of Isaiah prevails, and in Isaiah 18, he basically points out that is not a good idea. The Lord will deal with this. Don't get involved. So, at the last minute, Hezekiah does not join in this particular revolt, which is just as well, because in the 711, the Assyrians come back, absolutely trouch Ashdod. They destroy other Philistine cities. The Egyptians fail to turn up and help the Philistines at all. And then to add insult to injury, people that fled from Philistia and the other places, they ran to Egypt to try and, seek protection and sanctuary in Egypt. The Egyptians just handed them back over to the Assyrians. Don't trust the Egyptians. So then, Sargon II is in power. Hezekiah thinks, all the while Sargon's on the throne, I think I'll just pay my taxes on time. But then Sargon dies. And so Sennacherib comes to the throne, and Hezekiah has other ideas. Again, everybody else is kind of revolting, and Egypt looks like it's going to possibly be powerful, as if they hadn't learned anything from what happened to the Philistines. And there's this guy called Merodach Baladan, who seems to be a guy fomenting problems back in the east. Read about that in Isaiah 39. Anyway, they call together a big war council, and lots of the surrounding neighbours all decide to join this council and go and throw off the yoke of Assyria. They think, with Egypt behind us, they've got the tanks and the big guns. We'll be going places. We'll be all right. So, King Paddy of Ekron, on the other hand, decides, actually, I don't think this is a good idea. So Hezekiah has him thrown in prison, just so he doesn't cause any problems. And then everybody else goes about making defences, because they know once you stop paying your taxes to the Assyrians, they generally come knocking on your door with the bailiffs, and they want it with extra. So they build defences in Jerusalem and other areas. They built this great water tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel in Jerusalem, which even today you can walk through with a flashlight up to your knees in water. It's brilliant. Go there on your holidays. I did. So Sennacherib is none too happy about what is happening. His taxes have dried up. They all think that they can get away with this. He's going to come and he's going to kick butt big time. So he turns up on Tyr's doorstep and, deals with them. Then he lays the siege to Jerusalem, and it's a bad siege. So Hezekiah basically pays off Sennacherib. He says, can we offer you some money? Can we get out of this? And there is a crippling tribute to be paid. But the Assyrians don't want to be there any longer than they have to be, plagues breaking out and all sorts of things. So, he takes a crippling tribute. He wants Paddy put back on his throne, and he takes a number of Hezekiah's daughters as concubines off to Assyria. So, after Hezekiah, you have Manasseh. Now, Manasseh was a loyal Assyrian vassal. In fact, so loyal, he assisted the Assyrians on campaign in Egypt. Peace and prosperity spread through the land. And you can see that in the archaeological record. There was a lot of new building programs going on in this period. So the money was coming in. Everybody was living happy lives, even if they weren't worshipping the Lord, because this guy was into worshipping the Assyrian deities and pushing that program through. So he's considered an evil, bad king. And his son was no better, Ammon. And again, the same sort of thing going on. Peace on the secular level, religious life was going down the toilet. And then eventually, Josiah comes about, and you've probably heard the stories of Josiah, and we'll just look briefly at what was going on in his time. So the important thing is we see the fall of Assyria happen at this particular time. So in 627 BC, Babylon gains its independence. It's sort of like, the domestic problems that the Assyrians had been having for a long while suddenly erupt in Babylon. So the Babylonians are the people that are starting to take over. And you've got these incursions from the north as well, causing lots of problems for the Assyrians. Now, basically, Nineveh falls in 612 BC, and the Assyrians are looking like they're right on the back foot now. It looks like Babylon's going to take over. Now, the Egyptians thinking, we don't want a powerful Babylon in charge any more than we want a powerful Assyria. Better to have a weak Assyria in the way as a buffer zone. So Egypt makes an alliance with Assyria and wants to go and sort out the Babylonians and check their power. Now, unfortunately, Josiah sort of sees that the enemy is the Assyrians. And why would the Egyptians want to go and help them? So basically, Josiah turns up with his army at Megiddo to stop the Egyptians going up to meet up with the Assyrians. Now, the Pharaoh says, look, stand aside, my quarrel's not with you. You won't have any of it. And basically, Josiah is no more than a road bump on the way to the main event. Unfortunately, Josiah gets killed, and the Egyptians go up, meet up with the Assyrians, fight the Babylonians. Unfortunately, they get defeated at the Battle of Carchemish. So Assyria ceases to exist. Its empire just crumbles. And the Egyptians come home. And they come home and they start mopping up. Basically, Babylon is in control, anything east of the Euphrates, and Egypt is in control of anything west of the Euphrates. So, Jehoahaz becomes king in Judah, okay, but not for very long, because Pharaoh Necho comes back, and as I said, he's starting to mop up and sort out and consolidate his power in the region. Now, he thinks Jehoahaz is probably a bit too pro-Babylonian for his likings, so he takes him off into captivity and puts Jehoiakim on the throne, who is a vassal to the Egyptians. He's a bit of an Egyptian lover. Well, that is until the Babylonians turn up, and then Jehoiakim decides he's a Babylonian lover and starts paying his taxes to the Babylonians, which the Babylonians are quite happy with. Then the Babylonians go, and then Jehoiakim thinks, I don't want to pay my taxes to anybody. I just want to keep all the money for myself. And so they reappear and start laying siege to Jerusalem. So Jehoiakim's a little bit worried here. He's not going to do too well. But fortunately, he dies. It's thought that possibly he was assassinated before the end of the siege. And Jehoiachin becomes king. That's his brother. No, his son. Sorry, his son becomes king. And his son decides it's probably best to give up now, throw the towel in, sue for peace, pay our taxes, and hopefully Nebuchadnezzar will just think, my dad was a rotten bad and I'm okay. Well, Nebuchadnezzar kind of thinks, yeah, okay, I'll let you off, but you're coming back to Babylon with me. And he installs Zedekiah on the throne, who is Jehoiachin's uncle. So Zedekiah is now king on the throne in Judah. The Babylonians go back with their captives. This is when Daniel goes back. This is when a number of captives all go back. It's the first deportation to Babylon as hostages. But Judah still exists. Well, anyway, basically Zedekiah is fed up of paying his taxes, decides to get in with Egypt again, revolts, and the same old story. Nebuchadnezzar turns up, lays siege to Jerusalem, and takes the city. He kills all of Zedekiah's sons in front of him, the last thing he ever sees before Nebuchadnezzar puts his eyes out and takes him off to captivity. So now we come into the period of the exile. So lots of the people, but not all of the people, they left some of them in the land to tend the land, but they took a lot of the people off into exile in Babylon. And so, there's the destruction of the temple, there's the destruction of the walls and everything like this. This is a terrible day in Judah's history. And will they ever come back to the land? Has God forsaken them? Has he given up? What's going on? And those are all the big questions. And those are the questions that the writer of the book of Kings asks. How did we get to this situation? Well, if you think about it and you look back at all what's happened, this is how you ended up in this situation. That's what the question that the writer of the Book of Kings is looking at. Anyway, there's a post-exilic period, which means there must be a time after the exile. And we've done this recently, so I'll just sort of rattle through this. So we did this when we were looking at the book of Nehemiah and all that kind of period, and I've done it with the ladies as well in Tuesday group when they looked at the book of Esther. But we're now in what we call the Persian period. So Cyrus the Great comes to the throne, and he declares that everybody can go back to their homelands. The Babylonians are deported people from all over the place and put them places. Well, what Cyrus has said is you can all go home and all worship your gods and pray for me and pray for the empire, and it'll all be great. So, and we see that decree there in Ezra. There's a copy of it there on the Cyrus cylinder, slightly different wording, but one's in the Bible and one's, a Persian source. But, there it is, pretty much what he was saying. So, the altar was rebuilt in Jerusalem and its foundations were laid. But then they started to rebuild the temple, but then due to local opposition and just general apathy and people couldn't be bothered, and world politics, the work on the temple halts. Well, Cyrus goes, Cambyses II comes to the throne. And this guy goes down and invades and conquers Egypt. He basically knocks Egypt out of the picture as far as anything. So the Persians are like the big power in control in all of that ancient Near East. And basically, he has to go down and ask for help from the Arabian kings to get through there. Now, something interesting is that Cambyses did not honour the Cyrus decree. Now, Cyrus decreed that people could go back and worship their gods for basically to bless the empire and the king. And he stopped that. He stopped the wood coming in to be the rebuilding of the temple and stuff like that. Now, there's that interesting, enigmatic passage in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13. And this is where the angel comes up to Daniel and he says, "Then he said to me, 'Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humble yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the king of Persia.'" Now, this prince of the kingdom of Persia is thought to be Cambyses, and this is what this sort of incident is talking about here. It's just an interesting aside. But yeah, Cambyses was preventing any further building or Yahweh worship going on. And this is the time when lots of trouble is breaking out for the people in Jerusalem and Judah. Well, Cambyses dies, Darius I comes to the throne. So we hope that things might change. And indeed they do. And you've got the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, they start prophesying and sort of like get the building project back on its feet and sort of like get them rebuilding the temple. And the work resumes. Darius is behind it 100%. It's always good to have the gods on your side. Temple's completed in 515, and everyone's quite jolly and happy about that. Now, we get that period of time where the Persians and the Greeks start kicking off. And some of you might have heard of the Battle of Marathon, otherwise known as the Battle of Snickers. Now, Darius invades Greece in 492 BC. Lots of younger people wouldn't get that joke. But Darius invades Greece and gets beaten by the Greeks. Then Xerxes comes to the throne. And this is the period at which we see Queen Esther also. She becomes one of Xerxes' wives. Now, Darius I, as I said, had invaded Greece and didn't do a very good job of it. So Xerxes feels he needs to succeed where his father didn't. So he invades Greece about 10 years later. Now, you might all have heard of the film 300 and, the Battle of Thermopylae. Well, this is Xerxes, and he is allegedly the big fat guy with jewellery all hanging off him as he's presented in the film. I don't think he was quite like that, but that's Xerxes. So anyway, he won, but it was a costly battle. He lost a lot of people. And then to add insult to injury, he lost the Battle of Salamis. Obviously, his army wasn't as good on water as the Greeks were. So they go back, whipped, defeated. So Xerxes' reign had expensive foreign policy, beaten up on the Greeks, and the domestic investment was a low priority. So Judah, Jerusalem, all those areas were just kind of falling into decay, really. They weren't investing in that because he was spending money on a big arms race with the Greeks. Anyway, Artaxerxes comes to the throne and things begin to change. So you get this Delian League. You might have heard of Pericles. Anyway, basically the Greeks are kicking off all over the place and seem to want to expand their empire and be very Greek everywhere. So the Persians aren't too happy about this, so they have to start investing money in their territories. So in the mid-5th century, we see lots of forts being built in the Levant, strategic towns have to become defended, and the province of Yehud, which is what it is known by the Persians, or Judah, is brought kicking and screaming into the 5th century. So, the province of Yehud, it was just an undeveloped backwater at this point with, a temple and not any walls. New settlers were assigned farmsteads and they were sent back to go and start to populate the province of Yehud, which is what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, with people with this second return. Supplies and tribute increases. If you're farming the land and you're doing a good job, you're going to get more yield. So it was a good investment. They also increase in military reserves. If you've got lots of people in the land that can wield a weapon, then they can fight the Greeks when they land on the beaches. They also found that foreign administrators bred resentment. People didn't like Persians being in control. So if you put a local in charge, like Nehemiah, then you're more likely to get the people on your side. And they did this all over the place, not just in Jerusalem. And then they moved the provincial seat, which had for many years been at Mizpah, they moved that to Jerusalem. And that kind of, again, that would get the people in Judah on the Persian side. They think, these guys are good, they're looking after us. They're building us a new church, great stuff. So, it's a way of I scratch your back, you scratch mine. This is the period at which Ezra turns up and Nehemiah, and we looked at the book of Nehemiah just recently. And, he rebuilds the walls at Jerusalem. And he's still having problems and hassles there. But, he's got the backing from the king. And then finally we come to Malachi, who probably ministers, and his prophecies I would date between the first and the second visits of Nehemiah. And I think I pointed that out, at least in our own home group, where the book of Malachi falls in, where things have slidden once Nehemiah returns to Susa. And so Malachi is there saying, come on, you've got to offer your sacrifices, Lord, stop, all this terrible stuff. Then Nehemiah returns and boots that guy out of the temple and all sorts of stuff, and things become better. But Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, and it's probably one of the last ones to be written. And then you end up in the intertestamental period, where the books of the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha are written, and which I'm not going to talk about this evening. So, just a few books that you might want to consider. So, this is a great book, A History of Israel, and it's run up to a 4th edition. I think I've probably got a 2nd edition over there on the table. This is a great book, and it puts all the stuff into context, and it reads like a good history book. If you like reading history books, you'll enjoy this. It's a page turner. If you don't like reading history books, you probably wouldn't like it anyway. You wouldn't have come tonight. Israel and the Nations by F.F. Bruce. Again, that's another very readable book. He puts everything into context, so he brings in all the extra stuff that we know about the Egyptians and the Assyrians and how that all meshes together. Both these books are quite old, really. I mean, I think John Bright's book was written in the 50s and F.F. Bruce's was sort of back in the 60s. They're quite old books, but I think they're the better books. There's newer books out, but I've not really got to grips with them. They're trying to be too clever, and I think these just say it kind of how it is. This is a great little book, The Chronicle of the Old Testament Kings, written by John Rogerson, who used to be the head of the Biblical Studies Department in Sheffield, and I did know him because I used to cat sit for him. But he didn't give me a copy of his book. But this is a good little book, so you can look at all the different kings. There's one in the series about the Egyptian pharaohs as well. He has a few sort of quirky ideas, but, you know, on the whole, you've got an idea of when these guys were reigning, and he pulls in a lot of the critical stuff, and there's lots of lovely colourful pictures in it, and I've left my copy at the back for you to have a look at. So you're thinking, okay, I need to get into the text. I need to sort of like be reading Kings and Chronicles and how this puts together. Now, the two best series, I think, are the NIV application commentary. Any of those in that series, I've always found really helpful, whether the Old Testament or the New Testament, and there's a number of them at the back for you to work with on your projects this weekend. Unfortunately, I don't have the one on Kings or Chronicles, but they're really good because they come in, every sort of chapter is dealt in 3 sections. So the first section deals with the text and looks at the Hebrew words and the critical analysis and the structure. Then you've got the bridging the contexts, you know, how we might use it. And then you've got an application chapter. So they're great, you know, if you're preparing a sermon or a Bible study, they've got all that application stuff in there. The only downside is they are all written by Americans. So the application tends to have an American context. So you might have to work a little bit on that. But the Bible Speaks Today, they're a lot cheaper and they're paperback and they tend to be British. Very similar, they've done a lot of hard work and dealt with all the critical stuff, but at the same time there's a lot of good application, often written by church ministers who know what they're talking about, so they're good for preaching from. So I would recommend either of those series on whatever book you're wanting to look at. They will deal with all those kind of issues. Thank you for listening.